Well, welcome back. We now come to a very, very interesting session. The standard model has been take, make, and waste. And then some decades ago, we came along and said, well, let's try to use resources more efficiently and move towards sort of eco-efficiency. And then about 13 years ago in the Atlantic magazine, William McDonough and Michael Braungart came out with quite a seminal article. And this said, wait a minute, we run the risk of just doing the wrong things better. And actually, we need to rethink the whole business and start thinking about closed loops. So you don't take, but rather you reuse what has been used already. And that's what this session is about. Is there anything to this? Is it actually doable? And are we ready for the kind of revolution that it would entail if this was to become commonplace? And we have a very distinguished set of players here. We have, starting at this end, we have Ramon Arratia, who is the Sustainability Director of InterfaceFlor. We have Jeremy Oppenheim, who is Senior Partner at McKinsey, in charge of all of their work on sustainability and climate change. We have Stefan Sackler, who's Business Manager for SafeChem Europe, who is actually putting this idea into practice. We have Steve Evans, who's a professor at Cambridge University, who is a leading researcher and advisor and writer on this subject. And in the far end, we have Giles Hutchins, Global Director, Sustainability Solutions, AtoS. Right, why don't we start with you, Jeremy? Give us the context.
Well, Andrew, first of all, it's great to be here, and this is a hugely important topic and one which McKinsey is spending ever more time on because of its significance. So I want to touch on three things very quickly. One is just the strategic case for this agenda, because it's an agenda that has been around at least 15 years and probably longer. So what makes it relevant and exciting now? And then we'll just touch a little bit on the reality versus the strategic prize, and then talk about some of the necessary transformations. So in terms of the strategic context, as McKinsey, we've invested a huge amount in the last few years in trying to understand the whole resource productivity space. And let me just throw just a very few statistics at you, data points on which we can anchor this conversation. If you come at this whole question of circularity through the issue of landfills, which is a place where most countries have started, in fact, they come from a perspective of, can we continue to throw away at the scale that we have? And here in the UK, our landfill capacity will be more or less used up before 2020. Right? And of course, you go to other countries, and let me give you a specific example. In Beijing, the landfill capacity that they see there will be used up by 2015. Now, this isn't a very inspiring way to get into the debate, because we're not just about avoiding use of landfill. We're actually about transforming business systems. And the interesting thing is that when we look out there, what we see is that the rate of improvement in the way in which the world uses material inputs, so the big heavy stuff, right, has been less than 1% a year for the last 30 years. So we've all been talking about it, but while labor productivity has increased by roughly 2.5% a year for the last 25 years, right, material productivity has increased by less than 1%. Energy productivity has increased roughly just over 1%. Right? So we are in an era where, on the one hand, other indicators of productivity are growing very fast. These ones around material energy, I can give you the same numbers for water, are growing slowly. And yet, wherever you look, right, the case for tackling these areas of material performance improvement is growing, whether it's the size of the growth in global population or in economics, or just the sheer scale, right, the tremendous scale of demand for increased production and consumption that will come over the next 20 years as 3 billion more consumers enter the middle class. Right? So there is a massive, massive strategic case for getting on with this. If we look at reality, the reality is way short of the strategic and business benefits that could come from this. Let me give you one, again, fact that should throw into perspective where we are today. There are a total of 32 products that have been certified as cradle-to-cradle products in the world. They are niche, they are frankly irrelevant, right, on the whole, and I hope I'm not doing anyone a great disservice, but they're not going to change the global economy in the way that we need compared to the growth of demand and the kind of productivity transformation that we need to see. If you take a very, very easy to recapture product in the States, so if we take polypropylene and we look at the 6 million metric tons that are produced and consumed in the States every year, 10% gets recovered. If you look at steel, which could not be more valuable, right, in today's economy, given what's happened to iron ore and steel prices, less than 35% globally. Less than, even in the States, even in Europe with advanced systems, we're at 50 to 60% of recapture rates. You look at the rest of the world, it's much lower. So we are miles and miles off the pace. And everyone else will talk about what it's going to take, but just to kind of throw one or two thoughts on the table. If we're going to close the gap between the strategic imperative, the requirement to push up material productivity improvement from less than 1 to 2 or 3 or 4% a year, and do it every single year for the next 20 years, versus where we are today, right? We're going to have to not only work at the micro level and reinvent the products, redesign them from scratch, we're going to have to rethink how companies actually operate in cultural and system terms to drive their own kind of circularity in their own business models. We're going to have to drive it through to systems that are quite transformational at the city and national level. And finally, we're going to have to come up with a different way, and this will be back in your territory, Andrew. We're going to have to come up with some different economics, because the accounting and economic systems simply do not support the type of transformation that we're going to need over the next 20 years.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was great. So the need is urgent, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're actually really doing this at any scale at present. Let's turn to Steve. You were professor of life cycle engineering at Cranfield, and now you are researching at Cambridge and advising on precisely the issue Jeremy's talking about, which is why aren't companies doing this?
Well, I'd like to take that a bit further. It's an excellent introduction to the argument. We need to differentiate between closed loop and waste reduction. I'm sure that most people in the audience have a relatively mature understanding of this, but we are maybe a small gathering compared to those people who work across all of business. Getting an extra life out of a molecule is a fantastic thing. But it's not infinite lives. It's not closed loop. We shouldn't have a party. I'd like to congratulate everybody in the hall who's not wearing a tie for reducing the demand on tie production. Hands up. You can also make fun of everybody who is wearing a tie as swallowing the planet, if you want to take that argument. This is important, because we have to understand that the transformations are required to move to closed-loop business models. It's infinite recycling. So anything that stops at 2 or 3 isn't getting us there. Now, the research center that I work with, we have 2 main research agenda. One is eco-efficiency. We had a really excellent introduction to that subject from PepsiCo, who showed us the sorts of things that you can do with no technology or low technology or little investment. We work, for example, with Toyota, who've reduced the energy to make their cars by 44% across Europe at about 8% per annum. These are really interesting numbers. Why aren't we doing it? Why weren't we doing it 20 years ago? Because it was still costing us money then. This is excellent for momentum, but quite honestly, we visit companies and factories and businesses who are not doing it, who are still at the 1% and 2% per annum targets. Now, if 8% per annum is perfectly feasible and it doesn't cost a lot of investment, there are some really interesting research challenges, I would suggest, to understand why. But today's agenda is about what's going to happen after we've squeezed all those efficiencies out of the material system. How are we going to transform our material system? And most of us are au fait with the waste hierarchy. We've really become rather good at recycling and reuse and temporarily keeping things out of landfill. But we are challenged by the reduce and remove elements of the waste hierarchy. And those are the places where the benefits are greatest. If we reduce the need to create a kilogram of food, that kilogram of food has its own resource shadow. The resources that were needed to get that 1 kilo in front of you. In the food system, that's at least 1 extra kilo. If it's a washing machine, it's at least 10 extra kilos. If you save a kilo by not using it at all, you've saved 11 kilos. We need to understand not just our carbon footprint, but our resource shadows as well. Well, if that's the ambition, why is closed-loop transformation so hard? It seems like a very obvious thing. And if you read wonderful books like Cradle to Cradle or Natural Capital, you just say, hey, this is logical. We should all be rushing to these business models. I'd suggest there are 2 main reasons that we're observing in the companies that we work with. The first is the system innovation dilemma. It is difficult to innovate on your own. And closed-loop business models demand that different parts of the system move forward together. I call this the you go first challenge. Who's going to go first? Who's going to take the greatest risk? Only those people who can afford to change the entire system and to take that and to reduce that risk by financing the entire transformation. There aren't that many of them. We might see some good examples today, certainly from Interface, are being very brave in this area, but it's a big step forward. The second challenge is that it's perceived, a very important word, it's perceived to be difficult to make money by selling less stuff. It's not the first sentence you want to introduce to your new CEO, is it? I've got this great idea for a business model. First, we sell less stuff. Do you think he's going to listen to the second, third, and fourth sentences? The challenge is, how do we bring in externalities? How do we get finance for those? And there are specific, very technical challenges. For example, if we move to those business models, who and how do we get insurance from? Where do we get it from? How does that change? These are real technical issues which need to be dealt with. Again, the system innovation dilemma. I'm not going to wait for the insurance industry to transform before I can move to leasing business models. But it's a necessary ingredient of leasing business models. So what can we do? On the systems innovation side, we need more agreements. We need to work collaboratively. I would suggest that there are plenty of examples out there. I personally like the Marks & Spencer's and Oxfam model. The key lesson from here is that we have to look for unlikely friends. It is not our normal partners that we have to partner with. And the challenge there is you have to kiss a lot of frogs, right? You know what I mean? And how do you know which is the unlikely friend that you should be having a conversation with? It's actually quite tough. The second is the search for business models that internalize resources. We'll get an excellent example soon from SafeChem. But when we observe those small companies, if people want to ask, I'll give them examples later. When we observe those companies that are internalizing resource-based business models, they've had to draw an ever bigger envelope around what they think their business is. That's quite a scary proposition. Not many people go bigger and bigger and bigger in order to solve a problem. Our natural approach to problem solving is to slice it up and solve the sub-problems, which means we're never going to get to closed-loop business models. And my last point, if that doesn't sound hard enough, governments really have very little idea about how to engage in this process. And it is one of the cheapest and most effective things they could be doing because it doesn't require enormous subsidies. It does require innovative thinking on the part of government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Let's turn now then to a company that actually is practicing this, Stefan Sacker of SafeChem Europe.
Yeah, and I think I'm here to give you a very concrete example of how such a closed-loop business model can work. SafeChem is a 100% subsidiary of the Dow Chemical Company, so we are talking about chemicals, and to be more precise, we are talking about solvents for industrial cleaning applications. So when you have a metalworking process, you have to introduce metalworking oils into that process to make the different process steps, etc. And after that process, you have to get rid of those clean and precisely working part afterwards. So. And what we are offering is solvent solutions in a closed-loop business model. So we are supplying the fresh material and we are taking back the spent material for recycling, so closing the loop. But it does not stop there because, as you are saying, a lot more belongs to implementing such a business model. We are talking about chemicals, we are talking about solvents, and solvents have a certain product-specific risk, an inherent risk in the product. So we are also enclosing the process in which these products are used. We are supplying the products in specially designed safety containers, virtually emission-free transfer of the solvent to the cleaning machine. State-of-the-art cleaning machines today are hermetically sealed as well, so there is virtually no emission during the cleaning process. And they have an internal distillation, so the actual first closed loop is happening already at the customer site. The solvent is continuously distilled and reused within that process. And today, because of this technology, customers are using one and the same solvent bath for up to 4 years. But that is only possible if the supplier educates the customers how to do it and gives them the necessary and appropriate tools to do it. And then we come to the services, and that's why we are talking about chemical product service systems. It's not just about supplying the product and taking it back, but it's a lot more. It's about giving customers tools to measure the solvent quality on site by supplying test kits. It's about offering lab analysis for more detailed analysis. It's about providing stabilizer concentrates that customers can add to the solvent on site to prevent any breakdown of the solvent and to prevent any contamination and any danger to the cleaning equipment. Because if you have an entirely closed cleaning equipment, it's about the same like with modern cars today. Years ago, you knew how to repair your car. Today, you have to trust on what the garage is doing and what your cockpit is showing you. So you really need to trust on the supplier and on the advice of the supplier how to maintain your process and how to optimize your process. But customers who are doing that and customers who are able to keep their cleaning bath for 4 years and in some cases even longer, they were able to reduce their solvent consumption by more than 90% compared to traditional processes. And I think that's a very significant reduction, and it can even go beyond this when we come to the service that we are now offering since a couple of years to customers, which is called chemical leasing. And I think that's a good example as well when you talked about internalizing costs. The concept of chemical leasing is that the customer does not pay per kilogram of solvent anymore and per item of service elements, but the customer just pays a monthly leasing fee for the whole process. So for the chemicals, plus the service, plus training, plus advice, etc., all in a monthly fee, which is linked to the performance of the chemical. So it's, for instance, linked to the number of cleaned parts. So you take the focus from the actual consumption of the chemical to the performance of the chemical, and that is the parameter for invoicing towards the customer. And if we take that approach, and that, of course, changes for us as a supplier the cost picture, because suddenly the chemical input becomes a cost factor for us as a supplier, because the customer pays the monthly fee. So we send our technical experts to the customer, tell him how to optimize the process, and with that setup we even get a further reduction of solvent consumption implemented, and we have cases where we achieved 97% compared to the traditional process.
Great, thank you, Stefan, very much. Let's turn to another company that's endeavoring. Ramon, you work with InterfaceFlor. Tell us about it.
Hi, we are a company which makes carpet tiles, cutting carpet into 50 by 50. We sell around 50 million square meters globally. And if you look at the latest figures we published, we know waste to landfill, 92% less, greenhouses emissions in the 70% reductions, despite of selling more product over the years. But the one figure which I think for me is the most shocking is a 40%, which is 40% of all our raw materials are already either recycled or bio-based. And for PR reasons, people say, oh, you are very far from 100. And yet, this is the, in my own view, the most significant achievement we've done, because it's extremely difficult to have a closed loop system of 100% raw materials and recycling 100% of your products. And I'll give you some of the thoughts that, looking with hindsight, we have seen during these years of trying to close the loop. The first one is recycling a mobile phone into cement is not very clever. That's downcycling. It's putting something of high value into something of low value. So what we like to see through recycling is called like-for-like recycling. It's separating each of the components of a given thing and recycling each of the raw materials into the same raw material. The same way that incinerating and recovering is in a lower form of recycling. It's just incinerating and recovering the energy. And yes, it's better than landfill, but we should aspire to true recycling. The other point we have learned is that when we talk about closed loops and cradle to cradle, we immediately think that we should do a very closed loop. We should recycle our own products till the end. Yet, look at how nature recycles. Organisms in nature don't eat their own waste, thank goodness. In nature, the waste from one organism becomes the food for another organism. And this is what we have seen in our industry. Rather than just limiting ourselves to make carpet from recycling nylon from our own carpet, we saw the opportunity of recycling other things, like, for example, fishing nets in countries like Canada, India, Pakistan, or Norway. And we're now recovering those fishing nets and making carpet of those fishing nets. So there is this idea of not closed loops, just loops, and sometimes open loops. And the idea of scavenge waste from other industries, that they don't see the opportunity, and then you tap into those resources. Other thought that we have seen, the way why we are recycling in our industry is because our product is modular. The carpet is cut into 50 by 50, so it's easy to install, it's easy to deinstall, it's easy to transport. And that's why we have been successful at taking back the product, because imagine that taking the normal roll carpet, this is very impossible, very difficult to manage to take back, and that creates logistical problems. So this idea of modularity, making things modular, like in nature, where everything at the end of the day is some molecules, some atoms of a very few different atoms, making this modularity helps recycling. The other one is being touched already, is the system thinking. And in our case, we're thinking, what is the point of a recycled and recyclable carpet tile if it is stuck on the floor? So you need the system where your product is installed also to play its part. And our products used to be installed with these glues. And we came up with a method that is like a sticker that you put on the corner of 4 tiles and makes the system modular. It's easy to install. So whenever you can have access to changing the rules of the game in the system, then bet for it. And sometimes you cannot do it on your own, and you have to partner with other people. Legislation is key. In some countries, many, unfortunately, throwing away products is cheaper than recycling it. If you look at some of the regions in Spain, you can throw away for 10 euros per ton. In the UK, you have the landfill escalator. It's going 88 pounds per ton until 2014. And you might think that you are very well advanced, but you look at Germany, they are banning the landfill of certain things, like carpet. So you cannot throw away carpet. And that's what we're lobbying across Europe. We would like to have a ban of the landfill of our own products. And you might think that is throwing stones against our own roof. But if you have done the homework and you have the technology to recycle it, then you have a huge competitive advantage. The problem is that legislation usually follows the voice of the low common denominator type of lobbies. And progressive companies usually don't have that, they are not that heard. The other one is scale. And it's very easy to come up with a pilot plant, but coming up with a recycling model which is scalable and that can recycle the 80% of all the product that you put in the market is extremely difficult. Reverse logistics, again, don't underestimate how how difficult it is to organize reverse logistics when you think that is the same as putting the products installed in your customer base. Well, it's a totally different equation. And again, it's the little things such as, in our case, how the pallets go to a building, sometimes don't fit in the lifts. Little things like that it makes it extremely difficult. And the other one is about the positive energy balance. It's not just recycling for the sake of recycling. You need to create a positive energy balance. You cannot spend more energy recycling something that manufacturing virgin. So these are some of the thoughts that we have seen in these years of trying to aim for a closed loop.
Great, thank you very much, Ramon. So, Jeremy, I'm sort of getting a little more encouraged now. You were a bit depressing, and now we're hearing some good examples. Now we're going to turn to Giles Hutchins, who works in an IT consultancy trying to inject some of these ideas. Tell us about it.
Thank you. Yes, this is fundamentally about business transformation, radical business transformation, people, process, and product, which perhaps isn't great news for those fearful of change, but of course, life is all about change. This perfect storm of economic, environmental, and social forces mean that our organizations have to adapt, have to evolve, and have to seek out opportunities over the next 5 to 10 years. That soon, we will see organizations separate from those that can achieve that, be adaptable, flexible, and seek out opportunities, and those that can't, that become firms of the past. This separation of the wheat from the chaff will happen very quickly over the next 5 to 10 years. And so I put to you in the audience, in fact, I'll ask the audience, put your hand up if you think The current business model, the current business paradigm, the mentality that we've all been taught at business schools and training courses across the land is fit for purpose for this radical transformation. Hands up. Good. Although the slight problem is that we're all currently following that business paradigm. Okay, there's bits and pieces, there's fragments that aren't, but this is a radical transformation that has to happen now, not in 5 years' time. It's 2011. We're already well behind schedule, all the contingencies being lost in the plan. It reminds me of a quote by Dawn Vance, Global Head of Supply Chain from Nike. I met her in Boston recently. Very, very inspiring lady. She said organizations have 3 options. 1, hit the wall. 2, optimize and delay hitting the wall. Let's be honest, a lot of us spend our time doing that, tweaking a current business model and slowing down the inevitable car crash. Or 3, redesign for resilience. And it's this redesigning for resilience which we call a firm of the future, a business inspired by nature. It's now time for us to start working with the grain of nature to explore the wisdom that nature has. It's been dealing with dynamic change for 3.8 billion years. There's plenty of answers all around us. And organizations, a couple that we've touched on here today, are already starting to do that, not just in the product, but in the process and in people approaches. So if you think of business as 2 sides of the same coin, to coin the adage that was said earlier, apologies for the pun, the first side of the coin is cost. Cost reduction, sustainable operational excellence, material throughputs. Clearly, we need to optimize that. The other side of the coin is value creation, innovation, creativity, collaboration, empowering and letting go the creative potential of the human. Why we're in business in the first place, to work around problems and challenges. Those 2 sides of the same coin are inspired by nature. Taking closed looping, cradle to cradle, industrial symbiosis, whatever it is, that helps drive both sides of the same coin. So now is the time. Hopefully in the discussion groups we'll find examples of businesses already doing this. I know there are many, who will be prepared to start sharing that so we can gain more inspiration in this journey forward.
Great. Thank you, Giles, very much. I want to open it now. If people are preparing to ask their questions, please raise your hand, just to get the ball rolling. I'd like to push a little more on why it's not happening. I mean, in some cases it is. We've heard several things here. Steve was saying that you know, there are a couple of reasons. One is sort of a standard externality thing. You know, you actually need a network, and it's the first mover problem. And so clearly there's there a role for government. But also we're hearing it's a mindset issue on the part of businesses. Our business schools, so Giles tells us, are not teaching right. And Jeremy tells us there's only 32 products out of several million, I assume, billion that are registered, where actually get credit for this. Now, take steel, for example. I mean, according to Jeremy, 65% of steel is not recycled. Now, the people who run steel companies, the people that use steel, I mean, they're not silly people, they're smart, they are maximizing profits, and hopefully some of them are statesmen and they're thinking of long-term profits too. Obviously, you know, as Ramon tells us, you could pass a law that says no carpets are allowed into, you know, landfill dumps. You could do the same for steel, and that would certainly get people moving pretty quickly. Who wants to sort of, where's the low-hanging fruit? I mean, what should be going on now that's not going on? I mean, we've got incredibly smart people working in departments of trade and industry and environment in Europe. I mean, why are they not sort of doing deals with business and really sort of tweaking the system so that we're making progress here? Jeremy, and then anybody.
Right, well, so it's a very good question, Andrew, and there, of course, is no single answer because it does depend on where you are. And so, you know, in developing countries, territory which you know extremely well, just the regulatory and industrial systems to be able to make sure that we recycle steel effectively are just not in place. So we should be clear that this isn't something that happens overnight, and let's not pretend that we'll be there in 5 to 10 years in China or India, because if we set ourselves up for that, we'll fail. But I think that there are some other factors at play. So one is just the kind of the institutional capacities and systems. But let me just throw a couple of things on top. The first is that if you look across Europe today, while I would argue that there is a massive employment opportunity around the whole circularity proposition, many policymakers will not buy that, and they will tell you that they want to hold on to the jobs in their steel plants, right? Because those are the jobs today, and all the other jobs we're talking about are tomorrow's jobs, and they don't quite understand them, and they're not quite as clear-cut and the vested. So there is, I mean, if we're just kind of straightforward about it, a standard vested interest, kind of, we know the jobs we know, and the fact that there may be some job somewhere else which isn't quite the same as the job in the steel plant in Belgium is a big deal, right? So that's point 2. And then the third thing that, just to kind of get us all moving here, is that while it is true to say that steel prices have gone up a lot, right, in the last few years, and that as a consequence is driving and should be driving substitute behavior, it is also true that cement prices have gone up and aluminum prices. So if you look at the substitutes for steel, those substitutes have also increased in price. And that's where we run into the challenge of finding a systemic transformation. Because if you go to the biggest user of steel, right, which is not the car industry, but is the construction industry, by a long way, you will not find any more, in general, conservative industry on the planet. Right? And there are 1,000 reasons, and the first 50 of them at least will be descriptions about safety, why they cannot introduce a range of new products that would be more economical in the use of steel.
Right. Steve. Thanks, Jeremy.
You did ask about 8 questions in there, so I'm only going to take about 2 of them. Firstly, it's already been pointed out that the lowest common denominator issue about how, for example, trade associations interact with governments. Governments are not well placed to have an argument with a company from whatever sector, cars, washing machines, milk, and say, your numbers are not quite what they could be. So, for example, we're still deciding what the future targets for passenger car fleet average efficiency figure should be. Well, in 2002, Volkswagen and Audi launched a 94 mile per gallon car. 94. For those of you not from the UK, that's 3 litres per 100 kilometres. That's 14-year-old technology. It is, and yet, they are resisting targets that are far away from those numbers. I think that's an issue. There are plenty of examples of agreements like the court-ordered commitment, site waste management plans, the plasterboard agreement, the milk roadmap. The government is trying to push these things, but as an external observer, it is so gentle that as soon as the commitment is in place, you find that industry is meeting the targets. And then they get an appetite, and maybe, for example, court-ordered version 2 will push harder. Government is not well placed to be an active participant in those discussions. It is scared to push hard. I spend far too much time in policy. There is an issue in the policy-making process. Yes, they are incredibly capable people, but many of them have challenges around assumptions of efficiency. If you're a business, you would be minimizing your energy and waste costs, wouldn't you? Everybody, many civil servants believe that. They're wrong. Funnily enough, the economists in the Treasury understand why that's not true. But the economists in other departments may not. It is my absolutely anecdotal observation that joined-up government is critical to this, so the different departments working together, and that occurs at a scale of government which should be, if I bothered to collect the data properly, a certain number of people. So we've seen a good example from Scotland today. I think if you look at the Flanders region of Belgium for waste policy, fantastically joined up. Only possible because of the scale of government. They don't think the people from the other department are evil. And I wanted to put evil into my speech.
So, government's too gentle. Thank you. Any other comments on this before we open it up to
I could just add
Giles?
a quick one, which is I think this is actually simply about human mentality. It's about you and I, where humanity is the problem here, but also the solution. We need to do more long-term as well as short-term, more mutualism as well as parasitism and exploitation, more courage as well as fear.
Yeah.
We are peddling a business paradigm that is no longer fit for purpose.
Yes.
Taking examples of inspirational, courageous business leaders like Paul Polman, who is saying to the stock market, no, give me 2 years to make real change happen. In 2 years, pathetic, you need more than that. But, you know, taking a step forward and actually saying what is truthful about making real change happen, that's what you need. Not you hoping that some statesman may have a long-term view. That's not good enough anymore.
Yeah.
I just want to put one possibly dissonant note into this thought, which is that when we look at the opportunities to improve productivity in all the dimensions we've been discussing, there is a lot of opportunity that falls short of the full circularity model, or even kind of transitions towards it. And whether that's in energy, or it's in water, or in any of the materials. And so I think there's a legitimate debate that we as a community, and I mean all of us, need to have, which is how does one balance a kind of an aspirational view about kind of full circularity and the real kind of transformational stories, which are inspiring, with a kind of a bit more of a pedestrian, pragmatic, you know, could we get an extra 25%, right? You know, improvement in the productivity of material use in the economy and the major systemically important economies over the next decade. And getting 25% is not going to require full circularity by any means, right? That takes us way beyond. And each time we come across as kind of circular folk, we might end up throwing something that's so difficult and so, in a sense, kind of beyond what people can get their arms around, that we end up being our own enemy. And I just think it's worth having that debate for ourselves and understand where it is that we should be pushing the full circularity agenda, and there are some places where we absolutely should, and where, frankly, we shouldn't be, because there are some smaller, more pragmatic, but extremely meaningful steps that can take us a very long way, but that doesn't require you to kind of buy the whole deal.
Mm-hmm. Aha, okay, well, that is precisely the debate we should be having now. The floor is open. Let's go over there.
Thank you. Patrick Lane from WWF. Thanks. Some great examples from Ramon and Stefan to bring this to life. I just want one simple question to Stefan. How did your board at Dow Chemical react when you told them, I've got a great methodology for reducing sales of our solvent by 90%?
That's, of course, a very good question, and this is, has not only been a challenge 20 years ago when we kicked this whole thing off, it is still when leadership is changing, and that happens from time to time in such a corporation. You have to make the case and again, of course. We have a nice slide showing just two curves. One is showing the chemical consumption, which is going down over time because of this whole concept, but the other thing is going up, and this is saying chemical product services or service solutions, So it's a paradigm shift from a volume orientation, from a commodity business at the end, to a performance business, to a performance orientation. And of course, being a commercial company, it has to be profitable. And if you position services that are needed to make this whole thing happen in the right way, and you are leading this, and we have been 20 years ago the pioneers in establishing these business models, then we can be proud today that we are, of course, making good money with it as well, and it's working not only from the environmental side, but as well from the economic side. And if you bring this argument, then leadership is more than happy to support this. So.
Good. Thank you, Patrick. Other questions? Yes, at the back there.
I'm Claudia Costanza from WasteWatch, and again, thank you very much for the great examples that we've just heard of closed-loop companies. But if I'm not mistaken, these examples are actually both business to business rather than business to consumer. I may be wrong there, but my question was really about the role of the consumer. How do we actually get the consumer involved in this and on board, of course, and how do we deal with problems of very diversified sources of waste that we need to collect the, well, our eventual secondary raw materials back from? And that's, for example, something I've heard quite a lot in the context of waste electrical and electronic equipment, where there's IPR, individual producer responsibility, and leasing models out there for business to business enterprises, but there's a massive challenge being faced actually getting the waste items back from consumers. So I just wanted to hear your views on that.
Great, thank you, Claudia. Ramon, do you have?
It is, you really touch on the main point, which is, yeah, for B2B it's easier than for consumers. And why it's easier? Because you have a more degree of control. You know where your product is, and the more control that you have in the B2B, that's why SafeChain is likely to be more successful than us are taking back, because they have a more degree of control. With the consumer, you don't have that. And the problem is that then the legislation we're putting on the consumer front is, again, on minimum common denominator, product responsibility, introducing fees, which don't give incentives for companies to redesign their products. So I would be more inclined to tax unrecyclability.
Someone else want to come in on this question? Steve?
I'll be quick. The WE-transposition opportunity for all the national governments was an own goal of enormous proportions, and every government has made a botch job of that, as you know. As has already been mentioned, reverse logistics and scale of industrial systems is important, and the scattering of product amongst consumers is a challenge that we have to deal with. Please come with great ideas about how to do that. If you think about the M&S idea, they said you can take your products to Oxfam and then get a voucher to come and spend some money at some other of your money at M&S. So think about that. The local logistics is provided by the customer, and the rest of the reverse logistics is provided by Oxfam, who are actually very good at this type of reverse logistics. So that scales it up and makes it effective. I would slightly differentiate on tax. I think it's very hard to tax specific products and specific technologies. I'd simply slap the tax on extraction and emission and let the market play the game of trying to become very efficient between those two. But I tax those two things very highly.
Thank you. Let's take some more questions. One there, and then we'll take one there as well. Let's take two at a time.
Hello, Vidura Ralapana from MS Intimates. You spoke about scattering of products among consumers, but one of the challenges we also have is the scattering of manufacturing in different countries. If you really look at what's happening now, most of the products that is consumed in this part of the world is actually manufactured in a different part of the world. So on top of that, when you add the complexity of a product, for example, my company manufactures lingerie, and if you look at a product like a bra, the amount of different components that get into it makes it virtually impossible to dismantle it and recycle or close the loops in any other form. And then you have the complexity of the stuff that is used in that product is actually coming from different parts of the world, and the manufacturing is actually not happening here anymore. So that actually makes the way we approach loops, or way we think about loops, much, much more complex than it appears on paper.
Thank you very much. Let's take one over here. Yeah. Oh, okay. This one. We'll take two more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Brian Walsh from Time Magazine. I suspect in the U.S. the first economic figure that President Obama looks at when he wakes up in the morning is the unemployment rate, which is over 9% there. very much a sense that he has to work hard to get the economy growing again. At the same time, when we talk about the scale, the challenges we're facing here, internalizing these externalities, these costs of becoming, a truly fully recycled economy, will we be able to continue growing? I mean, will we have to accommodate ourselves to slower rates of growth than we've had in the past, and what would be the economic effect of that?
Okay, 2 questions. Takers.
I can take the second one, but...
You take the second one then, the
yeah,
employment.
This is an immense opportunity for growth. Pumping quantitative easing into the system is like a heroin addict having another hit of drugs. That's just a complete waste of money for our economies. Putting that money into sensible, looking at industrial clusters, looking at new ways of operating, new ways of working, is a far more constructive way of getting employment down and kick-starting the economy.
Stefan, I mean, in your closed loop system, okay, you produce less chemical. What's happened to employment compared to a more traditional approach?
Well, I would fully agree on your comment, yeah, because the more the service component and it gets important, the more people you need that are, of course, qualified and have the right skills to do it, but the more opportunities you have to employ people on the service side. I mean, one thing, for example, is a product that we are now actively selling, actually, since 2 years, is an entirely training. Yeah, we go to the customers who are using our products and give them, first of all, like a 3-4 hours training lesson. And for that, of course, we need additional people, etc., to provide those services. And same thing on the technical side. When I talk about this chemical leasing example, we are sending our technical specialists to the customer to optimize the process. You need the people for that. So the more service intensive it gets, the more people you need, obviously, yeah, because it's not only about production of chemicals anymore.
Steve, you're an advisor to this government and other governments and to parliaments. I know you advise the House of Lords and so on these issues. How much evidence can you marshal that actually shows, that in answer to Brian's question, actually this is good for employment, or is that a myth?
That's a very tough question, because I think, and it's a really important question, because the evidence at the moment is not overwhelming. It's anecdotal. For those of us who operate in this world, we believe it. And we get stressed when people don't agree with us. But it's not of sufficient density and repetition that those messages have hit home. For me, it's very clear that I'm a manufacturing engineer. I love factories. And it is very clear that the age of concentrated production, that logic is dead. But it's going to take a long time before the brain and heart of people like me changes direction. The idea that one factory placed in one strategic location in the world is the best place with the biggest machines to make microwaves or training shoes, that's the epitome of the current logic, and it's disappearing. We will move to a system of distributed manufacturing in smaller factories located around the world using the modular constructions that we've heard talked about and the services. But it takes a long time, as Giles has pointed out, to change the way people think about the systems they spend their daily lives in. The old logic is safe, and if you're worried about your pension, I've got another 15 years yet. I will do whatever the current logic demands because I want to reach that point with a reasonable pension.
Well, this is a really crucial question you're asking, by the way, and it's not just in Europe and the United States. I mean, throughout the developing world, there is now the question, especially in the emerging economies, is this green growth thing real? And everyone's looking at China, obviously, and they're looking at Mexico and Brazil, where clearly there is some kind of upward spiral of employment generation. And so, for example, the government of South Africa, the Minister of Finance, is saying, look, if you can only show that there really are jobs in this, I tell you, you could change the way we do business. But absent that, it's very difficult to make the case. Who wants to take a shot at that first one? I mean, basically, we have such complex manufacturing processes from dozens of countries, hundreds of components. You can't disentangle it.
So,
yes,
for
Ramon.
example, if you look at the way we are structured, we manufacture more or less regionally. So for Europe, 99.7% of the products that we sold in Europe were manufactured in Europe. This is not only entirely for sustainability, this is to serve quicker to the customers. And I think we're moving towards a world where it's important, this service is important to be close to the customer, it's important to have the reverse logistics to take back products from the customer, and this model where the products are designed one place, manufactured other place, and shipped over all over the world, I think is going towards a more distributed manufacturing. So we, in Europe already, 99.7% of the products that we put in this region are manufactured here.
Wow. Here, two gentlemen there, and then here. And then back there, yeah.
Hi, Thomas Stang, AECOM. I was just going to raise a question for the panel to consider. We talked about environmental externalities, about what the impacts are to the environment, which are not on the balance sheets. But there's also this factor of labor externalities, because as my understanding right now is that you talk about closing the loop actually ends up in a lot of developing countries where a lot of waste electronic goods and other kind of equipment are shipped off. And then I think there's an episode that CNN portrayed once of this village in China where something like 25% of the world's electronic equipment ends up there, and you see people just, the whole community, ripping apart PCs, taking away the metals, etc., at huge labor and environmental costs. What can we do about that?
Thank you. In the front.
Thank you, Claude Fussler. Two questions, if I may. One general one. Is there anything in this concept of mining landfills for materials? And the second question is more for Stefan, is there are solvents used in many places. What would it take to go into, for instance, dry cleaning or other markets to apply your SafeChem system?
Thank you. Let's have a third back there.
Hello there, I'm Louis Brimacombe from Tata Steel. I just want to set the record straight about steel and steel recycling. Steel is 100% recyclable, and round about 90% of all steel at the end of life is recycled. So this figure of 35%, we shouldn't get confused about this. And in a way, I'm advocating that people should understand materials more and communicate better on data. I think the figure of 35% for steel is, of the new steel made in society now, about 35% comes from scrap. And that's because that's all that's available now, because the steel that was made 20 years ago has been sitting in society doing its work and has now become available. If you want to have 100% recycled content of steel now, you'd have needed to make more steel 20 years ago. But that's my first point. We've got to get a better understanding of the role of materials and understand data about them. The second point I'd like to make, I think Ramon's talked a lot of sense, it's really interesting. I've been talking to my board and talking about reuse of steel. So steel frame buildings, there's a great opportunity to dismantle a steel frame building and rebuild another building. But I think it was mentioned earlier in the discussion that the red tape and the safety and the design issues are a massive inertial objection to making that happen smoothly. I think what we need is more demonstration projects to show that these things are reusable and that they can be done safely and economically. And then from that, stimulate the business stimulus to go forward. But we need a bit of demonstration to help with the risk.
Good, thank you. This is the last round of questions, so if anybody has a burning final question, ask it now. Otherwise, we turn. Oh, there is one back there, thanks. And then we turn to the panel.
Hi, it's Peter White from Procter & Gamble. The one thing that surprised me in this discussion is nobody's talked about security of supply. We've been talking about this as something that's good to do and to avoid the negatives of throwing things away, but the issue of security supply going out to 2050 are going to be very real, and I think the WBCSD work's shown that. How do the panel see the whole issue of security of supply playing out? And we're already seeing it with rare earths from China, but what about other materials?
Good, thank you very much. I'll ask each of the panel just to reflect on those questions you've heard, and if you want to make any final comments, but very briefly. Thank you. Starting with Giles.
To touch on the social aspect, yeah, we're exploiting nature and we're also exploiting ourselves. So it gets back to the mindset again. And I think that I could link it, if I could, with the complexity of supply chains and finite natural resources going forward by looking at the longer term picture, by looking and understanding the complete value chain and having the courage to make systemic changes in our businesses globally and locally, then we will realize that these two have the same answers. They both have opportunities. And so we can reuse in reconnecting, and so actually bringing opportunities to connect people. So that village, rather than just focusing at one particular aspect, actually being decluttered from that and being part of the solution rather than the end of the problem. So yes, we have some major fundamental challenges coming downstream, and so we're being forced to do this, as well as seeing the opportunities of doing it.
Thank you, Giles. Steve.
We in China and labor externalities, at the moment we're observing a number of emergent solutions, and no surprise, if you look at them and assess them at a system level, they're poorly designed. And that's because they're emergent. We need to be better at designing those systems and taking control of that. Don't ask me the detail how question, that's far too difficult. Claude, landfill mining. The issue with landfill mining, I would suggest in practicality, is that if we imagine landfill mining to be the equivalent of mining. If miners had to wear biohazard suits, we're then beginning to understand the cost and technology implications of landfill mining. It is not a golden source of materials because it is incredibly difficult to get out. I do think it'll happen though, because we've just put so much fantastic material into there over the last 100 and 200 years. Rebuilding buildings, I think we can prove that it's technically possible and create standards, but until you deal with a system issue, that architects will not win a design competition if you give them the constraints that you must use the existing steel frame, and therefore they will not design a design that uses it. And I would want to deal with that issue as well as the technical issues. Security of supply, it is incredibly important. It is my personal belief that non-linear disruptions will occur, and then we'll sit up and take listen and pay attention. And it's likely to occur in food rather than in rare earth.
Thank you, Steve. Stefan.
Well, I would like to address a bit the question from the front here, because that's, of course, exactly going into the right direction. Yeah, you have done now a certain market segment. What is next? Yeah, it's about continuous development. And one thing is, since last year, we are expanding this business model to North America. Yeah, so taking the European blueprint and adapting it to the North American market for solvent cleaning. And the other thing is absolutely, I mean, when you look in applications like dry cleaning, where perchloroethylene is used as well, we are working on that as well. We are in certain European countries already having a similar approach, closed loop for dry cleaning, supply and safety systems, take back of the spent solvent, and are expanding that all over Europe, absolutely. Because well, the market dynamics are a bit different in dry cleaning. Yeah? You are not talking about industrial companies, and we are coming more closer to the consumer even, yeah? Because dry cleaners are small shops, yeah? In many cases family-owned shops, and it's a different thing to change the mind of such shop owners compared if you have a cooperation, an industrial cooperation, where you are talking about sustainability. So it needs certain adaptation to the business model as well, and what we are doing, we are closely cooperating with the different stakeholders in that area. That means the dry cleaning associations. That means as well the waste management companies, the distributors, because we talk about dry cleaning distributors being one-stop shops. They are selling the hangers, they are selling the plastic wrap, etc. So different dynamics than in the industrial sector. But yes, absolutely, that's on our agenda.
Thanks very much, Stefan. Jeremy.
So many points. Let me just focus on two. Our sense is that the history of recycling and waste management and all of that has been very much focused in particular geographies on volume. You know, how much stuff can we in one way or another, get back into and manage. And the opportunity which has been, I think, identified by many people around the room and also here at the panel, is that we can shift this debate to one about value, right? From volume to value, all right? And it's both economic value in a classic sense of the resources that we have and the prices of them that are already market prices. There is, I think, an environmental value agenda that will come as we increasingly price externalities of one form, or get a decent price for water, right, in more places. And there will be some value that will be increasingly, one way or another, associated with elements of security. Quite how that gets priced in will depend on the very specific resource that we're talking about. So I think that the real opportunity that we face is to really get our heads around the value at stake, right? And to be quite granular about it so that we can talk about specific resources, and to then think through what those steps on the journey are from, if you will, taking modest incremental moves, which in some cases might get us a long way. We could get a long way in certain aspects of water management without having to go to full circularity, whatever that might mean. And where in other cases the value is such that we need to go the whole way. As McKinsey, the one thing I will say is that we have made a decision to put together a very significant applied research program over the next year or two. And I'm happy in the lunch or whenever to talk to anyone about it, because I think what we see is that there are wonderful individual examples. There are some good governmental initiatives, but what we'd love to do in a circularity sense is bring some of the best of the private sector together with some of the best and most progressive at the city and national level, and one or two of the NGOs that really want to get serious about this space, and see if we can do something that is circular and transformational to take this agenda forward.
Good. Thank you, Jeremy. Ramon.
In terms of security of supply, as Peter raised, it's a huge issue. And obviously rare earths, and then I would say phosphates is even more important. Not only because how little we have, but also the geopolitical risks. Most of it is in Morocco. Not for our industry, we are not seeing this radical security of materials threat because we make it from polymers. But the whole polymer industries, the margins are being eroded because of high increase. So we're really feeling that. And decoupling ourselves from those virgin materials is absolutely key. Now, making products with 100% recycled materials doesn't necessarily decouple you from that price, because you need also diversity of suppliers. And let me give you an example. If you would take back and recycle materials, then those materials, usually, they need to go back to some of your suppliers, and then you buy from those suppliers. If only one supplier is ready to make the investment, then you are depending on that supplier, so you would pay more. You need your supply chain to be diverse enough so you make them compete against each other. So sometimes it's very naive to think that with just putting more recycled content you decouple yourself from virgin material prices. Regarding labor externalities, I think it's coming because the equation is the price of the raw materials versus the cost of labor. And in the developing, because the developed world, as developing economies develop, we will have higher cost of labor there. And they will not have anywhere on earth to outsource. So the equation between labor and cost of raw materials will be more balanced.
Good, thank you. Look, it's now lunchtime. Thank you all very much. Fascinating discussion. It strikes me that whilst whether it's closed loop or almost closed loop may not matter very much in substance, and we need to aim for both of them. I do think the concept of a closed loop is extraordinarily important to hold before policymakers. I think it's something that citizens can come around. I think it's something politicians can get. It's the stuff of speeches and legislation. What is very clear is that the private sector needs to, just as you're doing, Ramon, lobbying to get those rules in place that will help move us forward. And the people in this room, I'm sure, have a very important role to play. We've had some great examples here, and also some great sort of thoughts from the academics and advisors as well. So thank you all very much. Ramon, Jeremy, Stefan, Steve, and Giles. Thank you all. It is lunchtime.